Okay, let's pray. Silent prayer. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're looking at Jacob's time of trouble, and we're going back, and one of the reasons we're going back is because we see that we are truly seeds of Abraham if we accept Christ, and if we pass these issues of equality in that verse about Jew, Gentile, bond free, male and female, that we're being tested on that in the movement right now. And we really need to see that we're children of Christ, because we're coming up to be able to do a work for Christ at the end of the world here, to witness to the Gentiles, the Levites and the Gentiles, or the Nephilims, to bring other people into the message. And to do that work, we have to be fully equipped and ready to go forth to battle. And we see in the life of Christ that when he gets to 30, he starts his ministry and he goes into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan. And we're paralleling that with Jacob's time of trouble, where Jacob's wrestling with what he thinks is an enemy, but it's really God. And we're trying to understand what he goes through in this time of trouble, because this is the time period we're in. So in order to try and understand our experience, we're going back and looking at Jacob and his experience, because he is us, but he's also a son of Isaac and Abraham. And we see Abraham referenced in Galatians 3, because we're seed of Abraham. And I want to see what that means. What does it mean that we're seed of Abraham? So on one level, we're humanity because we're children of Abraham physically, but on another level, we're divinity because he was a child of God. And he's the father of the Jewish race and the father of Christianity in that sense. He's one of our pioneers, our patriarchs. And we're going back to see how his life affected Jacob and what Jacob had inherited from this situation. So we saw that Abraham's called out. He's called to leave his country, his kindred, and his father's house. And each of us are called to separate from these things. So it's possible that some of us may not have already done that in a spiritual and mental sense, that we've still got some dependence on these things, and that God is seeking to show us how to separate from these things. And he promised him 3 things. He promised that he would give him a land, that he'd make him a great nation and a great name, and that all families of the earth would be blessed by him. And this is the promise that the Messiah would come through him, promise of the Messiah. This was the holy trust that was given to Abraham, that's now passed on to Jacob, this promise that he would give birth to the Messiah. We saw that God calls us through the teachings of his word and the events of his providence. He opens doors for us to exercise self-denial, hardship, and sacrifice to go through that process as a Christian. And in all that, he's teaching us to depend on him alone. And this is what we see that Jacob's learning in Jacob's time of trouble, that he is to depend on God alone and to desire and seek his blessing more than anything else. So we'll go back and we're seeing what Abraham went through. And we see that after following this call, he's faithful to God. He sets out on the journey. The first kind of failure we have in the life of Abraham is this lying over Sarah. Sarah's his half sister. He lies that it's his wife, that she's not his wife, that she is just his sister. And in telling that partial truth, he's showing a lack of faith, basically. Because she's pretty, he thinks that he's going to lose his life over her, that people will want her. And instead of risking his own life, he's got this fear of losing his own life. He lies about her and he commits this deception. And in that, we see the sexism, that he's willing to sacrifice up Sarah to save his own skin. And we also see that he's paid for this by Pharaoh, and he's only her brother, but it's like he's given a dowry. So we see this male-dominated society that he's operating in. So let's turn to Patriarchs and Prophets, and this is 129.3. And the next paragraph as well. So this is a commentary on what he does here, and also she draws it into our experience. So this is 129.3 and 130.1. So let's read that first paragraph. If you're there, Sister Katie, can you read that, please?
God has always tried his people in the furnace of affliction. It is in the heat of the furnace that the dross is separated from the true gold of the Christian character. Jesus watches the test. He knows what is needed to purify the precious metal that it may reflect the radiance of his love. It is by close testing trials that God disciplines his servants. He sees that some have powers which may be used in the advancement of his work, and he puts this person upon trial. In his providence, he brings them into positions that test their character and reveal the defect and weakness that have been hidden from their own knowledge. He gives them opportunity to correct these defects and to fit themselves for his service. He shows them their own wickedness and teaches them to lean upon him, for he is their only help and safeguard. Thus, his object is attained. They are educated, trained, and disciplined, prepared to fulfill the grand purpose for which their powers were given them. When God calls them to action, they are ready, and heavenly angels can unite with them in the work to be accomplished on the earth. Want me to continue?
No, let's just comment on that paragraph. So, what does God do to us?
Well, it's trying us because it sees that He can use us, but He needs to purify us first to make sure that there's no hinder characters that need to be dealt with, any wickedness that need to be dealt with, defects, before we are completely fit for purpose. So this is why, he has to try us, to try us, and in doing so, it's a walk with God. So we are becoming educated, trained, and disciplined, and prepared to do the work, in the power of the way that God wants it to be done, and not in our own powers.
So he educates, trains, and disciplines. Through affliction. And when each of us became a Christian, is that what we thought would happen?
No.
I don't know about you, but I thought, the minute I became a Christian, I thought, oh, everything's going to be rosy now. I've got Jesus, I know the truth. This is great. It was such a day of rejoicing, our baptism. On the day of our baptism, my sister and I got baptized together. A man came up to us and said, you're going to get tried now. The devil's going to send along a man who isn't Christian to marry. He said something about a man, because we were single, and they'll send a man to trap us. And I thought, oh, he said, now your trouble's going to start. And I thought, I never really thought it like that. I never thought the trouble's going to start now. I thought, all my troubles were over. What do you mean the trouble's going to start? And I think it's a really learning curve. But there's two things I wanted to pull out. There's two. She repeats two words. Actually, she probably repeats more than that. But what she stressed in a couple of places. She talks about the furnace twice in the first two sentences. God has always tried his people in the furnace of affliction. It is the heat of the furnace that the dross is separated from the true gold of the Christian character. So this is all about our characters and about what he's trying to do to purify our characters. But I saw in the next section, she stresses something twice. Can you pull out anything, Katie? Why is he doing this furnace? Why is he doing that?
For the advancement of his word.
So the advancement of his word, but what is it from our benefit, from our perspective? What does it show us?
Ourselves.
It shows us ourselves. So the last part of that sentence, it says, in his providence, he brings them into positions that test their character and reveal defects and weaknesses that have been hidden from their own knowledge. So part of this education is a revelation of weaknesses. It reveals weaknesses and defects that were hidden from ourselves. So we're in this place of self-denial, not intentionally, but it's so much easier to see other people's faults than our own that were hidden. And so this is an education. And so he says, and it is repeated in the next sense, so I think it's quite important, that word, weaknesses. So whether we would call these sins defects of character, I mean, on one level we might say they're sin, but here she calls them weaknesses. I think this is, I don't know, this is how we see that. He brings them into positions that test their character and reveal defects and weaknesses that have been hidden from their own knowledge. He gives them opportunities to correct these defects and to fit themselves for his service. So in some way, these defects are hindering them from doing a perfect service. So this is all about the work of God. So she stresses the advancement of the work at the beginning of that sentence. And that's mentioned again later about the work at the end of the paragraph. So it's about the work, and it's about their weaknesses in reference to the work. So he gives them opportunity to correct these defects. He shows them their own weakness and teaches them to lean upon him. So his primary purpose for showing that weakness is to teach them, to teach us to lean on him. And isn't that what he's already said up there? So we've already learned that when it's said up here that we go through self-denial, hardship and sacrifice to depend on God alone. So this is leaning, to lean on him. And this is the same as to depend on God alone. And this is a process. So this doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen even just in the first part of the journey. So it's like, I think Sister Betty says, so he teaches this at the beginning to fit us for the work, but it's an ongoing process of revelation, which I don't think even probably doesn't stop this side of heaven. So it seems we still have weaknesses that we haven't seen when we're brought into different situations and different ministries, you know, as you go in your journey, that need strengthening. So he shows them their own weaknesses and teaches them to lean upon him, for he is their only help and safeguard. Thus his object is attained. They are educated, trained, and disciplined. And this is a process when you think about training an army or training any group of people, children in a school. It's education, training, and discipline. It takes years, it takes time to do that with anybody for them to grow, because you can't show them their weaknesses overnight. And this is another thing she says, that God brings us into different circumstances. She says, as fast as the people of God can bear it, he reveals to them their defects of character and their errors in doctrine. And many times we're not willing to let go of it, so he has to bring us around again to a different test and a different situation where we can see that we've got errors in doctrine. And I would say that's sins of our fathers, and defects of character is our own sin. So we've got these sins or defects that need dealing with. And in his mercy, he puts us through different paces, basically, so that when God calls them to action, they're ready, and heavenly angels can unite with them in the work to be accomplished on the earth. So this is about the work that needs to be done. And we've seen already that this work that God wants doing is to form a church. So he wants you to be, on one level, he wants you to be perfected, but he wants to use you to bring others into the church. So this is all about a work of service. So there are definitely hidden weaknesses in our characters that need exposing, and we see this in the life of Abraham. So right here, if we use him as an example, he's got a weakness in the way he deals with Sarah. And this is you can see how this is going to affect him later. He's part of a patriarchal society, and he's got a fear of losing his own life. And so God's trying to show him those things in this incident. So in that crisis, he has a lack of faith. So God's trying to show him where he's not leaning on him to deliver him out of the situation. So in one level, he's fled from a situation of death in a famine-torn country. There's a famine there, so they're threatened with death. So then he flees to Egypt to escape that. And the very thing that he's kind of fleeing from, his fear of death, I guess you could say, drives him to make a mistake when he gets to Egypt, that he fears of losing his own life for a different reason. So let's read the next paragraph.
Can I just bring in a couple of points from this?
Yes, make a comment.
You know, I mean, the words that really struck me, you know, what God is trying to do for each one of us is that of education, training, that's two different things, discipline, and preparedness. And that's what we see here. They are educated and trained and disciplined, prepared to fulfill the grand purpose for which their powers were given them.
And I think that education and training is about themselves as much as anything. So this training is not so much about, it's twofold. It's about learning who God is and who you are, which is what the everlasting gospel is for, which is what these prophetic lines are doing. It shows you about God and his kingdom and about your character. But this primarily is bringing out the fact that it's about their character, so that he puts you through this furnace of affliction for you to see who you are, see your weaknesses and put them away. So in any trial, we need to be asking at every step, Lord, what do you want me to learn from this? What is there in my character that needs refining? How am I supposed to handle this situation? It may even be to learn the voice of the enemy. It may not be that you've got some fault and failing as the trials come around us, but this purpose of this paragraph is to show that what your weakness is, where you're not leaning on God. And that can be in many areas. I don't know if people have got any examples of where they feel that their character defects were revealed to them when they were put in a situation if they've not been in before. I don't know if anyone's got any practical examples of that. But obviously, in this situation, Abraham's never been in Egypt, in this situation where he feels under threat from another nation. And he treats his wife like this. It's a new situation, but he's seen this weakness here of self-preservation over someone else, perhaps. But he hasn't got that perfect love for Sarah. But he would do that to her. I think all of us have been in situations where we've seen, actually, I didn't realize this was an issue, and especially, I think, if you get married and have children, and I'm sure even without that, single people are you're part of other people's families, your own family, you've got siblings, you've got people you have relationships with, where you, or work colleagues, where you've seen the character traits that were brought out by a situation that you never saw before.
I mean, we can take a practical illustration what Abraham has gone through, going through a country. We too, we have a practical illustration when we go through customs all the time. Because, you know, how is it that we're going to approach with our answers there when we go through there? You know, maybe there's something that we might have that, according to their law, is not appropriate or something, you know. And we're going to put also a white lie out there saying, well, okay, you know, this and this, I mean, put in sort of a half truth there, but is it right? And then, you know, all these things there, you know, because discipline is part of the habit. So it's.
And when you make mistakes, it's learning to change that mistake, and so it becomes a habit to do the opposite.
Yeah.
Because he's showing you how that could be used by the enemy, and how it can cripple your usefulness later. So it's really important, yeah. And I remember saying that when I got married, I thought I was a nice person. You know, when you become a Christian or whatever, even before I was a Christian, you think you're a nice person. Then you become a Christian, you realize you're not a nice person. But then when you get married, you realize even further how ugly you are, and how selfish, and how driven by self-preservation, my rights, my viewpoint is right, because it comes into contact with someone else 24/7. It's a really good learning curve. And it can be part of the trial and affliction because you're face to face with yourself, which is what the battle is about. And so you see in your spouse, you see things that you can admire, you see things that really can test your character, because it's also reflecting your weakness. Perhaps it's something that you find difficult, and then it's magnified in the person that you've married. I think
marriage is a big learning curve.
It's a big learning curve. It's a big mirror that's held up in front of you, and you see how often when I react badly to a situation is because my walk with God is not completely right, and it's a reflection. I've got up, I'm tired, whatever, or I feel resentful. I've not had some study time that morning or whatever, and then something the spouse does will be used as it's your fault, and to blame, finding someone to blame, which is so Adam and Eve. The whole initial conflict is who's to blame for this, so that I don't want to take responsibility. And Ellen White talks about people who have weaknesses like they don't like taking responsibility, or they've got a desire for ease, which is similar to not liking responsibility, desire for ease, don't like working, whatever the weaknesses are that are brought out by situations you're put in, and where he shows you where you need to take responsibility here, or you need to change this. And even with this equality test, I'm finding it's amazing how easy it was just to put the responsibility on the spouse, on the husband, because he's the headship model. The man is in charge. If he makes a small mistake, that's okay. It's on his head. It's not my problem. And even sort of following him behind that, thinking, well, he'll get the blame. And like in the situation with Abraham and Sarah, Sarah out here, she doesn't get the blame. Abraham's the one that gets told off by God for lying. And she doesn't say, wait a minute, excuse me, he's my husband. Actually, she doesn't say anything, because she's in that society and God sees that, and the man gets the blame. And so
she was just following instruction from the husband.
Exactly, I'm just following the headship model, and it's it's amazing how I've got to take responsibility. Wait a minute, you know, you're responsible just as much as he is. You're on an equality now. There's no hiding behind somebody else anymore in that sense. So I think it's for us to see our weaknesses, and that's what these trials are for. And we need to be open to that, that we're in this time of trouble now, where God's trying to show us our weaknesses, where we're not leaning on him. There's some areas of our experience where we're still not leaning on him. And that's where we're dysfunctional. We can't love each other. We can't love God in the way he wants us to if we're still holding on to things of the past that we can't even see. So he's putting us in this position now to open our eyes to our own weaknesses. So let's read the next paragraph. During his stay in Egypt.
Yeah. During his stay in Egypt, Abraham gave evidence that he was not free from human weakness.
So see again, sorry, the weakness. Weakness is the third time she's mentioned it now.
He was not free from human weakness and imperfection. In concealing the fact that Sarah was his wife, he betrayed a distrust of the divine care, a lack of that lofty faith and courage so often and nobly exemplified in his life. Sarah was fair to look upon, and he doubted not that the dusky Egyptians would covet the beautiful stranger, and that in order to secure her, they would not scruple to slay her husband. What? He didn't? He doubted that not that.
He doubted not that the dusky Egyptians would cover the beautiful stranger. He had no
Oh,
doubt
doubted
they
not.
would, they would
Yeah, I
cover
was
her.
like confused.
They would
Okay.
lust after her.
He reasoned that he was, sorry.
Sorry, just stop there a minute. What does dusky Egyptian mean?
Yeah, I don't know.
What do you think? What's dusk at the time of day?
Shady.
Shady.
Uh,
Dusky is semi-darkness, isn't it? So she's
Shady
semi-dark.
Egyptians.
Partially dark or obscure.
So presuming the dusky Egyptians are darker in complexion, I'm thinking it's making a point here that they've got a dark complexion in some way. And I'm assuming, I don't know if Abraham would have been lighter or Sarah would have been lighter or the same colour or not, but it seems to be there's some connection with the way they look that would make them cover her as a beautiful stranger. Now, if we look at, I don't know, society in general, there's a kind of elevation of the white skin, whether this is a racial issue here, that he recognises they're going to cover her because she's a different colour from them. It seems to me to be bringing out something about the physical looks of Sarah. We know she's beautiful, but why is it that she's coveted? So that I think there's even nationalism going on here, that he recognises this nation's going to cover his wife, and they're going to behave a certain way if they see that. They're going to not scruple to slay him, because that's the kind of background they're from. That's he's putting that on them already. But how did Pharaoh end up treating him? Really well, didn't he? And even when he saw that they were wrong, he didn't kill it. He was scared to death that God was going to punish them further, and he treated them especially carefully and sent them away. So maybe his perception of these people was totally distorted based on his preconceived ideas about the Egyptians.
Do you think he remembered when they, not that he was alive, but do you think somebody told him that what happened when they left Egypt? Wait a sec. No, that's way later. Never mind.
No, I know it's really easy to get these stories mixed up, but it's important progression from here, because this is the first mistake he makes with this, and see what she says happens after this, which I thought was interesting, how it impacts future generations. Everything they did seems to have an impact. So I think there are nationalistic things going on here, but you know, it's speculation. So Karen.
He reasoned that he was not guilty of falsehood in representing Sarah as his sister, for she was the daughter of his father, though not of his mother. But this concealment of the real relation between them was deception. No deviation from strict integrity can keep God's approval. Though Abraham's lack of faith, Sarah was placed in great peril. The king of Egypt, being informed of her beauty, caused her to be taken to his palace, intending to make her his wife. But the Lord, in his great mercy, protected Sarah by sending judgments upon the royal household. By this means, the monarch learned the truth in the matter, and indignant at the deception practiced upon him, he reproved Abraham and restored to him his wife, saying, "What is this that thou hast done unto me? Why saidst thou, she is my sister? So I might have taken her to me to wife. Now therefore, behold thy wife, take her and go thy way."
So what's Abraham's problem? He's got a lack of faith. So we put that down. Anything else you want to say about his? And really, go on. This is like a faith. And he says, he highlights no deviation from strict integrity can meet God's approval. So he deviated from strict integrity. Says Tiffany, do you have any comments on that? Goes back to his lying. He's lied at this deception.
Yeah.
So now the question comes to each of us, what is this strict integrity? Only strict integrity can meet God's approval. So this was a partial truth.
Yeah.
And you could say he didn't tell a lie because she was his sister, but he didn't give the whole truth, which was tantamount to a lie in this situation.
And that's exactly what it says here. He reasoned that he was not guilty.
He reasoned. So when we use our own reasoning, that's often when we get in trouble. So we have to reason something through and justify it in our own heads. And obviously one of the reasons it's wrong is because his motive is self-preservation. He's not thinking about Sarai in this situation, he's thinking about himself and how he might die. And so maybe that affects whether it's wrong or right what he did, because it wasn't even for the right reason. But she seems to make it clear that no deviation from strict integrity can meet God's approval. So then we have to ask, what does strict integrity look like in all these scenarios that we have been discussing recently, offline out of the class, about when is it okay to lie in a situation like covering Jews in the Second World War? Is it ever right to lie about anything? It seems from this that it isn't. It doesn't meet God's approval to depart from strict integrity. But then it comes the issue, I suppose, of when is it wise? What does it look like to be wise as serpent and harmless as a dove? In how we deal with people? Does it mean we always give all the information? Do we need to give all the information? But if we know it gives a wrong impression, is that wrong?
Isn't there a quote that says even by giving a look to insinuate something that's not 100% is sin?
Yeah, but I think even this paragraph though, that we're reading it a certain way. I agree with what was being discussed before, where you have to consider what it means to love your neighbor. And in this context, Abraham is thinking of himself, period. So if it had been a different scenario, maybe she wouldn't have even said that he didn't practice strict integrity. We just don't know.
And we don't really have another example there.
No, we don't.
Of this, except Rahab, and obviously she's a bit of exception because she's not a Christian, she's not an Israelite, but she's still in that wall of faith even though she lied. But I don't think we could say she's put there because she lied, but she helped God's people and she put them first.
But there was another one though.
Esther.
Paul.
Esther's a huge one.
What is Esther?
Esther.
Well, just her whole thing with the king and not saying who she was.
But she doesn't say who she is, that she marries a heathen for a start. The whole thing is just, it's not going against, I mean, that's a different issue, but she's going against God's will in night. And Mordecai, pushes her to do that. I mean, morally, we can't justify it, but we know it's a prophetic story. But even the fact that she conceals who she is from him, is that a lie? Did he ever ask her? Did she have to make it an issue before? I don't know. If he didn't ask her, why did she have to say where I'm from and who I am? So I think it raises a few questions. But we see that because of that lack of faith, that Sarah's life is in danger now. So he's put someone else's life in danger by his lie. And then we see the integrity of Pharaoh.
The woman that kills the general of the other army in the tent.
Sister in jail, that drives the tent back home. Yeah, come in, have some milk, sit down.
I'll be friends with you.
Yeah.
Go to sleep. It's all good.
Yeah. Oof, I know. Pretending to be hospitable, pretending to be friendly so you can turn on them and bite. I have that question about David. When David pretended to be mad, what do we do with that? He escapes capture from the Philistine king? No, so one of the kings. He pretends to be mad and they just let him go. And you think, what's that? He's purposely deceiving them into thinking that he's mental to get out of trouble. And wouldn't that be tempting to do? Somebody's coming to your arrest and you just go, tropo is what they call it in Australia. They've gone tropical, they've gone mad. Is that okay? He doesn't seem to get punished for that. He gets off the hook. But in all these stories, is this man choosing to deal with the situation in his own strength and not allowing God to deliver him.
I mean, with all these different situations, we see that there's still consequences, even with David. You know, he's supposed to be going to war, and then what happens to the families? You know, they get captured by other people, and God could have probably changed it all around differently yet. We don't know.
Yeah, we don't know how it should have gone.
Yeah.
And even to the place where, he cuts off the garment of Saul, and afterwards he's smitten. I should have done that. We see even remorse in David's own life when he makes these, these deviations from strict what he thinks is right. It's very challenging to see what could have been, because we don't know. And so often we think, oh, that's okay that they did that. And I'm sure this is how they're reasoning. So you look at this situation, and now you put it in terms of Jacob. He's thinking, he must know this story from his grandfather. Grandfather lied about it, but he got out of it. God delivered him, punished Pharaoh, and it was a mistake, but he was delivered from it, so it's not that bad, is it really? Because we see Isaac does the same thing, follows in the footsteps of his father. He must have known this story. You can't believe that he didn't know this story. And he does the same thing. You think, why did he do the same thing? Because maybe he reasoned it wasn't that bad, he got out of it. But when I look at the Pharaoh acts with such integrity. He responds to God telling him off, and he says, go away. I mean, because if he was like the Pharaoh in Moses' time, he could have said, okay, who is this God that's giving me this dream? I'll just keep Sarah, or I'll kill her, or I'll kill you because you lied to me. He could have been completely different, but we see the way he behaves is admirable in this situation. In contrast, really. So let's read the next, I think it's the next one, 130.2 as well, and then we'll go on to the next thing. Because this is quite interesting, because I want us to see how it affects the next generation. I've got that to bring. We'll read paragraph 2, 130.2. Abraham.
Abraham had been greatly favoured by the king. Even now Pharaoh would permit no harm to be done him or his company, but ordered a guard to conduct them in safety out of his dominions. At this time, laws were made prohibiting the Egyptians from intercourse with foreign shepherds in any such familiarity as eating or drinking with them. Pharaoh's dismissal of Abraham was kind and generous, but he bade him leave Egypt, for he dared not permit him to remain. He had ignorantly been about to do him a serious injury, but God had interposed and saved the monarch from committing so great a sin. Pharaoh saw in this stranger a man whom the God of heaven honoured, and he feared to have in his kingdom one who was so evidently under divine favour. Should Abraham remain in Egypt, his increasing wealth and honour would be likely to excite the envy and covetousness of the Egyptians, and some injury might be done him, for which the monarch would be held responsible, and which might again bring judgment upon the royal house.
So this last part, do we think this is Pharaoh reasoning this? Pharaoh saw in this stranger, is everything after that written about Pharaoh? Is that how you read it?
Well, he got a plague, right?
Yeah.
So that's gonna do something to
That's
you,
a down payment to him.
So
don't we see a contrast to how he responded to a plague compared to the Pharaoh later, the Pharaoh that's raised up at the time of Moses? The direct contrast between these two Pharaohs. This Pharaoh, he fears God, he treats Abraham with respect and kindness. It says that he was kind and generous, which is what we see. He conducts him to safety, he goes the extra mile to get him out of his land. But what do we see as a direct result of this action? Why did she put that in there in the second sentence? At this time,
there were
laws were made prohibiting Egyptians from intercourse with foreign shepherds. So right here we see an issue of racism. Now, whether this is a I think we should put that down. So laws, racism, are passed as a direct result of this action. Now, why it is connected, she puts it in here to show some connection, I think. But what we see is that they prohibit this intercourse of Egyptians with foreign shepherds in having such familiarity as eating or drinking with them, so they're not allowed to eat and drink with them. And don't we see this in the life of Joseph? Joseph goes down into Egypt, his brothers come, and they're given the land of Goshen because it was not appropriate for them to eat together. And when he sits down with his brothers to eat, he doesn't sit at the same table because it's not right for Egyptians to eat with Israelite shepherds.
I'm just wondering now, okay, if this, was this law then implemented before Abraham came or after Abraham came?
Well, it says at this time the laws were made. So I think it's as a result of his coming. There's some connection with this law being made directly. She doesn't say it's a result of what Abraham did, but it seems to me that because it goes on to say, Pharaoh dismisses him to go. He'd ignorantly been about to do this damage. Then it said, Pharaoh saw in this stranger a man whom the God of heaven honored, and he feared to have him in his kingdom, one who was so evidently under divine favor. Then it says, should Abraham remain in Egypt? Now, is this Pharaoh reasoning now, or is this Ellen White saying this? Is what I'm wondering, because if Pharaoh's reasoning, this is quite a far seeing of the Pharaoh. Should Abraham remain in Egypt, his increasing wealth and honor would be likely to excite the envy or covetousness of the Egyptians, and some injury might be done him, for which the monarch would be held responsible, and which might again bring judgments upon the royal house. So, I'm not looking at this in context, but I'm just wondering if he's reasoning that, and he's seeing, actually, it makes sense to get rid of him, because if he stays here, he's just going to create more trouble. Look, I took his wife because his wife's so attractive, someone else might do the same thing, a bit upset with him. I'm just seeing if the next paragraph. The warning, I just wanted to read the next bit. The warning that had been given to Pharaoh proved a protection to Abraham in his after intercourse with heathen peoples, for the matter could not be kept secret, and it was seen that the God whom Abraham worshipped would protect his servants. So he uses this situation to warn the other nations that I'm not going to let you touch Abraham, even though he made a mistake there. This story goes out, and people see it's a dangerous thing to wrong the children of the King of Heaven. That's what it says in this paragraph. And then it says, the psalmist refers to this chapter in Abraham's experience when he says, in speaking of the chosen people, that God reproved kings for their sake, saying, touch not mine anointed and do my prophets no harm. So it's interesting that he brings good out of evil, because it's Abraham's mistake, but out of that, he protects him, and then all the nations get to hear how God will deliver his servant, don't touch him.
That's why David doesn't hurt Saul.
David doesn't hurt Saul because he's got an
That's not my anointing.
Yes, yes. And then she goes on to say there's an interesting similarity between Abraham's experience in Egypt and that of his prosperity centuries later. Both went down into Egypt on account of a famine, and both sojourned there. Through the manifestation of divine judgments in their behalf, the fear of them fell upon the Egyptians, and enriched by the gifts of the heathen, they went out with great substance. So she parallels the two stories there. So she's telling us there's some connection between them, and obviously we know there is, because they both went down into Egypt because of famine, that came out with substance. So Pharaoh here gives Abraham more than he already had. He's generous, that's why he's generous. But what I want us to see is the knock-on effect of what happened there. So these laws are passed, which make a separation and a distinction between the Israelites and the Egyptians later. And the very thing that this Pharaoh thinks might happen, doesn't it happen? Should Abraham remain in Egypt, his increasing wealth and honor would be likely to excite the envy or covetousness of the Egyptians. What happens when Joseph and his brothers go down to Egypt? That very thing, isn't it? They get the land in Goshen, which is all good. The Pharaoh blesses them. They're separate from the Egyptians, though. And then what happens?
They get jealous.
They get jealous. So now the Pharaoh dies that's protected Joseph. The new Pharaoh doesn't know Joseph, and they get jealous. And what are they afraid of?
That they're going to take over.
They're going to take over the land. The very thing it says that some injury might be, that they'll cover their wealth and honor. They're getting prosperous, the Israelites are getting prosperous in Goshen. The Egyptians say, this is threatening our national greatness. These people are taking our jobs. These people are going to take over our land. If there's an uprising, we're all going to be killed. So now Pharaoh's getting nervous and frightened. But the very thing that this Pharaoh sent Abraham away for is exactly what happens. Some injury might be done them, for which the monarch would be held responsible, and which might bring judgments upon them. So now what do? They pass the laws against the boy babies. So there's a direct knock-on effect of this division, and I think, what's the issue then? How could this have been prevented?
Abraham told the truth.
So Abraham told the truth. A law wouldn't have been passed separating the Egyptians from the Israelites, because that deep division meant that when they went down into Egypt, they had separate land from the Egyptians. So maybe what should have happened is they should have integrated in Egyptian society. Now, one of the reasons God allowed that was because he wanted to separate them from heathen practices. So they're in their part over there, worshipping their God over there, and the heathens are over here. So there was a separation, a marked separation to protect them from idolatry. But maybe if there had been more mixing and there hadn't been those laws about not eating and drinking, they could have witnessed to their neighbour, and there wouldn't have been that division and that threat then, because their prospering means we prosper because we're all together. But because they're seen as divided, now they're seen as a threat because they're different from us. So we can, even in that story, we can see this issue of nationalism is traced right back to Abraham and the mistake he makes with Sarah. So we can see how their actions in that time period affected their after generations. And she's going to tell us that, I think we haven't read the quote yet, how it's going to impact the next generation. Not this particular event, I'm only just seeing that now and reading it, but I think it's a crucial point when we're looking at this issue of equality. So these racist laws are passed which affect later what happens with Joseph. So we have issues of equality. He's got fear of death. He's willing to sacrifice Sarah instead of himself. He gets paid by Pharaoh. I'm just seeing we've got every point that we want to pull out of that. So now we have, let's skip to Genesis 15, where we see the promise is reiterated to Abraham. So we're going to read Genesis 15, 1 to 4. So I think that's covering most of that story. And now we're going to go to the next section where he gets this promise reiterated about the seed. So it's next to read. Henry, let's read that Genesis 15, 1 to 4. Now we've skipped over. We were last in Genesis 12. I'll just give you an overview. So 13 is Abraham and Lot. It's the story of Lot and the separation that comes between them, how Lot chooses Sodom. And then Abraham rescues Lot in chapter 14. So we have these kings coming and attacking Sodom, and they take, probably people know that story, they take Lot and his family and captive. And Abraham and 300 fighting men of his household. So we know Abraham's household is quite huge at this point, and it's interesting, he has 300. He has 300 fighting men, and they go after Lot and they rescue him. And this is when Abraham has this interaction with Melchizedek over paying tithe over what they've captured from Sodom. So we're skipping over that because it's not that relevant to our story. So let's go to Genesis. You've got 15. This is 1 to 4.
Okay. After these things, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. And Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless? And the steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, This shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir.
So what we see here is what's happening. God is repeating the promise that he's already given. Because Abraham says to him, I haven't got any children. Shall I make this servant who's born in my house, Eliezer, shall he become the promised one? And God tells him, no, that the person who's going to become your heir will be born of your own bowels. So it's going to come from your personal, physical sperm, seed, whatever. And we already saw how he didn't really value Sarai as part of this plan. And now we'll see the consequence of that. But here, he's being told and reiterated again that he's promised that he will still have seed, and that God's going to fulfill his promise to him. And it won't be Eliezer that becomes this child of promise. And then we go to 16, and we'll start reading 16, 1 to 6. Can you get that? And the rest of 15 is just him reiterating the covenant and God passing between the animals and reiterating that he will make him overthrow the land and take it from the Hittites and the Perizzites and all the ites, that he will give him this land. So he reiterates the covenant with him in 15.
Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarah said unto Abraham, Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abraham hearkened to the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abraham, that dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. And Sarah said unto Abram, My wrong be upon me. I have given my maid unto thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. But Abraham said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thine hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face.
So now this is very interesting. Something's repeated twice in the first 3 verses. Let me see what it was.
He went in unto her.
No, it's the first 3 verses.
But she can't bear.
Are we told something twice? Does it say it twice? Can't be.
Yeah, she can't bear twice.
Restrained from bearing. I see it in verse 2. Where else is it?
Verse 1.
Bear him no children. Okay, so she was restrained from bearing. That's emphasized. That wasn't what I was picking up. Try and link it to what we've already been reading.
The Egyptian?
The Egyptian. Twice we're told here that Hagar is an Egyptian slave. And I've only just made that connection. Where did she get Hagar from?
Egypt.
Egypt. And the only incident we have of Egypt is this incident of the famine going down into Egypt. So it's sanctified logic, is that the way you could put it? Speculation that she was picked up when they went to Egypt. Now, that begs 2 questions. One is, should they have been in Egypt in the first place? 2 is, should they have taken servants from Egyptians? So on one level, it shows they haven't got, you could say they haven't got nationalistic issues because they don't mind an Egyptian being in the household, but at the same time, she's a slave, she's a servant. So in that sense, there's inequality right here. We've got an Egyptian servant. So I don't know if we put that down as part of the problem. So now we're going to deal with the Hagar story, and we see that Hagar is an Egyptian slave.
Maybe Pharaoh gave them Hagar.
Maybe that was part of the goods, which is even worse. It's kind of like she's a possession, Egyptian slave. And you could say they haven't got nationalism or racism because she's pushing for Abraham to sleep with her, and she doesn't mind having a half Egyptian child. So in that sense, they've perhaps got some successful, their viewpoint on equality is not that bad. But think about the dynamics of this. Why does Abraham listen to Sarai in this situation?
There's a couple of weird stories in the Bible where they don't consult God, and it's always been weird to me. Like why he didn't
Gibeonites is another one.
Joshua, where he makes that deal.
The Gibeonites.
I'm thinking also another factor is it's a misreading, misreading the scripture, for us. So in his time, he misunderstood how God really wanted it, even though that he said it would come out of his bowel. He thought, okay, maybe then it's through another person. And, maybe Sarah's handmaiden, but it's still coming from him. So, you could see also a lengthy period of time in between. And
Right, so how it tells us there too, you made that point about time. What does it mean, hath restrained me from bearing? When Sarai says unto Abraham, behold now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. She's gone through menopause, isn't she? She's gone past the age where she can bear children. So that's one thing. So humanly now it's impossible. And the second thing is, how many years has he been in Canaan? It tells us in verse 3. 10. What does 10 symbolize in our text? Test. They've been tested for 10 years now, and he fails the test right here. So, but when you think about that in human terms, I promise you to have a child. You've been married 10 years. Do you think it's going to happen? 10 years is a long time to wait for a child, especially now when you've gone through childbearing. You're not able to bear anymore. If I got that promise now, I'm told, in 10 years' time, I'm 62 or whatever it is, you're going to have children, and you still haven't had them yet. You can't have them now. Do you really think it's going to happen? So this is why he does the Eliezer question. God reassures him. He says, okay. But what's he got in his ear now? He's got Sarai saying what? I'm past it. Do this thing with Hagar. I'm speculating because we don't have this evidence of this anywhere, but if Abraham felt bad about what he did back there, what's he more likely to do? To listen to it. Yes, to listen to it, isn't he? I think he feels remorse. He wants to please her. He wants to do what makes Sarai happy. because he's treated her badly. He's got to make up for it in some way. When we see that with David, with his sons, he's not willing to discipline because he's guilty of the same crime. How your behavior affects how you treat the person and how you're going to deal with them. So it's possible that he was more prone to listening to her because of the way he treated her, and he felt bad about it. He thought, she keeps on nagging me on this thing, let me just do it. So I don't know what was motivating him, except he's lacking faith in this issue as well. But obviously he agrees to it. He goes into Hagar, he has the child, and now once she conceives and has this child, she now treats Sarah badly. She's despising. She despises Sarah, so she's like got one over on Sarah because she's got the child now. So we see how this breaks down the dynamic in the family and how they treat each other. So there's issues there with relationships again between Sarah and Hagar, and she flees from her face. And the outcome of that is basically that, I don't want to go into too much detail because we're going to not get through this, but God meets her in the wilderness, and in his mercy, in his mercy, God meets Hagar in the wilderness and sends her back, says, I'm going to bless your son. Don't worry, it's not your fault, because she's a victim in this. And God treats her on a level of equality. He says, go back and submit. So on one level, she has to still be a servant, but he says, I'm going to bless your son. Don't do this, and I'll provide for your needs. I'll make him a great nation. So she goes back and she submits. Actually, that's not when she says a great nation. She just gets told to go back and submit, and he'll still be with her. But it's later, I think, when she deals with Ishmael, that he says, he'll be a great nation. So God in his mercy blesses Hagar in this situation. But we'll see something about this from Patriarchs and Prophets about Abraham. But we see that contention is brought in the household now over this issue, and how it becomes a source of continual trouble. And of course, once Isaac is born, this whole conflict between her and Hagar just escalates with Ishmael. And Abraham has the unfortunate duty of sending them away. So now we see the family split up with this issue. So let's read 145.1, Patriarchs and Prophets. Have you got that in the chart? No, you just read it. Thank you.
Abraham had accepted without question the promise of a son, but he did not wait for God to fulfill his word in his own time and way. A delay was permitted to test his faith in the power of God, but he failed to endure the trial. Thinking it impossible that a child should be given her in her old age, Sarah suggested a plan by which the divine purpose might be fulfilled, that one of her handmaidens should be taken by Abraham as a secondary wife. Polygamy had become so widespread that it had ceased to be regarded as a sin, but it was no less a violation of the law of God and was fatal to the sacredness and peace of the family relation. Abraham's marriage with Hagar resulted in evil, not only to his own household, but to future generations.
Okay, so right here we see how Abraham is conditioned or molded by his culture. So he's accepted the sin of polygamy, and this allows him to justify this relationship with Hagar. So not only now we see that he's willing to have a second wife, he's also, what does it say? At the beginning, he accepts without question the promise of a son. So we see his unquestioning faith in accepting that he can have this child of promise. But through the delay, his faith is tested in the power of God, and he fails to endure that trial because it takes so long. So we see it's 10 years now he's been waiting. We see his interaction with Sarai and how he's listening to his wife now, possibly because of the guilt of the past, because of the way he treated her in the past. We don't know. But he listens to her and he sleeps with this Egyptian slave. So now she obviously creates these problems between her and Sarai. But the thing we want to pick out is the last sentence. Go on.
I'm just thinking here, because I'm just taking a look, where God has called him out of. And out of the nation, relatives, and, the immediate family. So then this polygamy, that must have been something that was already in the country for him to even have considered it. And so he's taking this out, he's taking this, and God is now revealing it, that this is one of the things that he has to let go of, as well as far as his tradition and custom from his home country. So this is one of the
Yeah,
defects.
possibly.
that
I'm
he's
sure it's in the
correcting.
Canaanites, the land where he is as well with
Yeah.
the Canaanites. But where he's come from, it may have been acceptable to have.
And
polygamy as
then, when we're talking about that with Sarah, where, he had this kind of a disrespect, that could have come right from the relatives, because this is the way that they treated one another. So you see all these different things coming about why God is bringing them out of this atmosphere, is just because he's trying to prepare them in a different line altogether.
And we know this is sexism, to have more than one wife. I mean, how is that treating, how is that valuing the wife? How is that putting her in equality when he can have loads, but she can't have more than one husband? The whole thing is such a twisted society. So because of that, he accepts Hagar now, and he does this justification of making her the wife to get the promised seed. So what we see then is man going about in his own strength to fulfill the promise, which is always the problem. So he's got these promises at the back of his head, and they're given him to give him, confidence, to make him happy, to make him see that God's going to bless him in the future, and to give him confidence to leave his father's house and do all that because God's promised he's going to do this for him. But the very promises that God gives people, it turns it into a promise, a curse, really, because they try to do it in their own strength and then they fail. And you think, why did God even tell them that in the first place? Because now they've made a big mess of it in trying to do it. Just like Jacob, I always wonder with Jacob, why did you tell him in the first place you're going to get the blessing of the firstborn? Because the whole life now is shaped around how can I get this blessing? And it's a similar thing to Abraham. They don't endure the test to get God to give it to them in his own time. And this time is a huge test. We see in a lot of the stories, but we can see how in this instance it's connected to sexism, but it's all about faith and exercising faith against the time it takes to do it and taking it into your own strength, doing it in your own hands. And this was fatal to the sacredness and peace of the family relation. But the last sentence, Abraham's marriage with Hagar resulted in evil, not only to his own household, but to future generations. Now we could read into that on one level, that it's because he's created Ishmael, and Ishmael becomes the father of the Arab religion or Muslim religion. We look at how many problems down through history has been caused between Islam and Christianity, and the warfare and the bloodshed that's happened over those two different religions. That's one level of looking at it. But I'm thinking even on the level of Jacob and Isaac, how it affects them.
Yeah, Jacob.
And that interaction with their brothers, so-called brothers. So we see, first of all, we see Ishmael and Isaac and their interaction. And then we see Esau and Jacob and their interaction. And that whole way that Jacob treats women and the problems he has with women that have been handed down, and the whole birthright promise and how it's affected them. So he gets this birthright promise and he tries to put it into practice and tries to get it in his own strength, which is exactly what Jacob does later. So the after generations, she makes it clear, however what that looks like, future generations are affected by the sin of Abraham's sin in his own household.
Also then goes, with having two wives, immediately you're going to have jealousy involved between
Exactly.
the two. And so you see that also carried on even to that of Jacob.
Yeah, jealousy is a huge issue between the wives in that history. Yeah. So he has two wives and he has four wives, really. That's just a nightmare. This is Patriarchs and Prophets. Laughing. Share a joke.
No, just 4 wives.
4 wives. And you can really see the trial that would bring one person. 147.2. So we see then Sarai now deals wickedly to her handmaid after Hagar gives birth, but Hagar goes back and has to submit. And God doesn't forget her and promises that he will multiply. In 16, I think it says that the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. And you wonder about that. You wonder why God is going to bless Hagar with this man. Why does he say that? Why does he want to bless Ishmael and give him lots of seed when we see, looking back now?
He has to.
You think, why?
Because he's Abraham's offspring. The promise was that his offspring would be blessed and become great nations. God can't lie.
Which is incredible, isn't it? Because the very promise that was given to Abraham now has to be fulfilled through Ishmael on one level, because and Abraham brought that about. So he brings that about that this man is blessed, and he becomes a source of constant irritation to the children of Israel from there on. He says, behold, thou art with child, shalt bear a son, shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. So again, this is all about the blessing of the seed and the promise, and God is fulfilling this promise through Ishmael, which he gave to Abraham. It's like a counterfeit. Hagar's name actually means flight, so she flees here and she has to go back. I don't know the significance of that particularly, but God reveals how that the covenant's still through Abraham and Sarah. It's not through Hagar. So Sarah is an intimate part of his plan in God's eyes, but she never was really in Abraham. So Abraham was to justify, it's okay because it's still my seed. He must have seen her as nothing to, he's not valuing Sarah in this model because he's thinking, well, I can sleep with Hagar, it fulfills the plan. So he doesn't see Sarah as part of it at all because the bloodline comes through the male. So again, we see this sexist kind of attitude towards the thing, that the blessing will only come through him. So let's read this paragraph in 147.2. Because this makes it clear about this sin. He's got a box.
God had called Abraham to be the father of the faithful, and his life was to stand as an example of faith to succeeding generations. But his faith had not been perfect. He had shown distrust of God in concealing the fact that Sarah was his wife, and again in his marriage with Hagar. That he might reach the highest standard, God subjected him to another test, the closest which man was ever called to endure. In a vision of the night, he was directed to repair to the land of Moriah, and there offer up his son as a burnt offering upon a mountain that should be shown him.
So what does she highlight for us here then? What's she bringing out in this passage?
Test.
That he'll have a sign along the way to make sure he's not completely crazy.
Where does it say that?
Vision of the night.
In a vision of the night, he was directed to repair to Mount Moriah and there for his son. Okay, you're focusing on the last sentence. Sorry, I was focused on the first part of it. Why is he brought to this test? What's the problem? Because we're looking at sins of Abraham. He failed on 2 counts. Conceding the fact that Sarah was his wife. So we've got that up here. He's lied about his wife. So on 2 counts, Abraham has this sin. And because of that, maybe what I'm going to do is something smaller here. So can we get rid of this side?
It's pretty rough going when you think about it. You have 2, did he have to make up for all his failures in every other regard as well, in such an aggressive way? Or hopefully, I guess he passed the sooner, easier tests.
Possibly. I don't know. Every weakness God brings us round to. You know why it tells us we're brought round to test again and again until we pass it.
Yeah.
In his mercy. So the test gets harder each time if you don't pass it. And so we see this on this level of this story. We don't see him if he's got any other faults and failings because he's called a friend of God. He's lifted up in other places he pleads with God over Sodom being destroyed. He's interceding for his brothers the people in Sodom. You can see he's got some great characteristics, some great qualities, but this is the thing that's the key to his downfall in a sense. So God makes this is the issue that we need to learn from. I'll just reiterate over here, he's promised the man, he's promised to be a great nation. Certain name, and the promise that the Messiah would come through him. So just to bear that in mind when it comes to Jacob, because it's the same thing he's promised. This is the birthright promise. So he's guilty now, Abraham, because because of his lie about Sarah, and then his marriage to Hagar.
And that's all under the title of distrust.
And it's distrust in God's promise versus faith, perhaps we could put. So this is this whole contrast about which we learned down here that he's got to learn to depend on God alone or lean on him, which is the same one we've got to do, and exercise this faith through all circumstances, however long it takes, is to endure unto the end. But we see that the issues he has are all connected to his relationships to women or with women, and the covenant.
Faith.
And yeah, faith is the crux of the issue, but it's all connected to these two
He has
issues.
huge faith in other ways.
It's what?
He has huge faith in other ways, you're
It's
right.
huge faith in other ways,
So
but
it's
this area is his
specifically-
weakness. And yeah, we learned that trials and afflictions come upon us to show us our weaknesses. So he's got some weakness that is connected to the covenant, that he wants to fulfill the covenant, but he wants to do it in his own strength. He doesn't trust God to fulfill his word on the covenant, but he tries to find ways to circumvent that.
Yeah.
But it's because God sees his heart that he wants to please him. And so it's kind of like understandable when you think how long it took. How old is he, do you know, when Isaac's born? He's been 10 years in the land of Canaan when he does this with Hagar. And Ishmael is about 15, I think, when he flees. When he's about 10 when he's born. I think he's 100. So he's 25 years since he left the land of Haran, 25 years since he's first given the promise. And even that, I think he was 70 when he was first given the promise, because he goes to Haran where his father dies, and it's a few years there. So I think if you work it all out, it's about 30 years since he's first given the promise. And when you think about that, and Sarah's past childbearing, you think, well, actually, was that a lack of faith, really, to think this isn't going to happen, or to try doing it in your own strength? I know it's only 10 years into it when he does Hagar, but even 10 years, as we've said, she's past childbearing, and they've waited 10 years. So now he's reasoning, how is this ever going to happen? So there's some, leeway in a sense, you think, well, he would have done that. But God says, because of this, and because of this, now you have to sacrifice Isaac. So these two things lead directly to having to sacrifice Isaac.
It's rough.
It's rough. It looks rough. So if he hadn't done this, he wouldn't have to do this. Now, before, when I read this story, I knew this about the marriage to Hagar, but I never knew she connected it to the lie about Sarah. So they're interconnected things. So you think the lie about Sarah isn't that important, but it affects this story. And I think there's a connection because she's Egyptian, Hagar. If they hadn't been in Egypt, they would never get Hagar as an Egyptian servant. That's one thing. The second thing is how he treats Sarai in both these models. And this is sexism. Here, she's not valued enough over his life. He's protecting his own skin, lying about his wife. He's not bothered about her. And right here, he's listening to her when she's giving wrong counsel. And he's not caring about her in the fulfillment of this promise because she's not important. It's only through his bloodline that matters. So he can do it with Hagar, that's not an issue. So there's deep-rooted issues here of sexism that drive him to come to this point where he has to sacrifice Isaac now.
And both of those problems too are a relationship with the human element where it's human solution solving.
Human solution to the problem instead of what's God's solution to this problem, and what's he trying to show me about myself. Because if he'd really asked that question, maybe God could have shown him, the way you treat your wife isn't quite right. Because she's important to me in this story. And then he sends the angels to tell them at the tent, your wife's going to have a baby. And she's laughing in the background, and that's why they call Isaac laughter, because she thinks it's not possible, I can't bear children. But she's also called a woman of great faith. In the faith chapter, you think, great faith? She didn't have great faith. She encouraged him to go with Hagar. We might look at that on a human level and say she failed, didn't she? She blunked it. We don't see any great faith. But he sees her heart through that story, how she did believe like him. She did what God wanted her to be part of the plan, and how the child was born to her, that even though she seemed to express unbelief there, you think, why does he describe her as a woman of faith?
Because she wanted to fulfill that promise.
Yeah, she wanted to fulfill that promise, and maybe just the whole way she conducts herself with Abraham in that model. I don't know. It's challenging on one level because we see the distrust of both of them when they come to be visited by the angels of the tent. So anyway, that leads him now to have to sacrifice Isaac. So we can see the knock-on effect of that doubt and that distrust and how it affected Abraham, that he now has to go and sacrifice Isaac. So he sees that Sarah was part of the covenant. What else did he see? Then there's a blessing given on both of them. Isaac's birth is promised to them. So let's turn to Genesis 17. So Genesis 17, and we might just read, I might skip read it, but I was going to read the whole parts of it. So 1 to 6, and then we'll do 15. So we just read 1 to 6. That's it. Okay.
And when Abraham was 90 years old and 9, the Lord appeared to Abraham and said unto him, I am the Almighty God, walk before me and be thou perfect. And I will make my covenant between me and thee, and will multiply thee exceedingly. And Abraham fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham. For a father of many nations I have made thee, and I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee.
So right here, this is after he's committed the sin with Hagar. They've got Ishmael, and he's 99 years old now, and God's coming to re-enter into covenant with him to encourage him. Again, he stresses that he's going to multiply his seed exceedingly. Abraham falls on his face, and God talked with him saying, my covenant is with you. So God confirms the covenant with Abraham to give him courage and changes his name. Do we know what Abraham means? I actually put down what Abraham means. I think it just means father. It says exalted father is Abraham, and he changes it here to Abraham. And I think that implication is that he's going to have this seed. So it's H87 before, which is exalted father, and he changes it to 45, which is father of a multitude. So it's added on the fact that he's not just a father, he's a father of many multitude. So it's reiterated this blessing that he's going to be the father of many nations, many people. And obviously we know on a spiritual level, this is a commitment from God's part that he's going to multiply Christianity in the earth. He's going to have his children are going to multiply. And then if we drop down to 15, he does the same thing for Sarah. So he talks about the covenant in between and circumcision, and that this token of circumcision, and this is where we go to see the verse about slavery. So we've got Genesis 17:12 right in there, and it says, and he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man child in your generations, he that is born in the house or bought with money of any stranger, which is not of thy seed. And so here we see right there that there's equality in Abraham's house on one level, and I think we should see that. So in this discussion about the Jews, when they say, we have Abraham as our father, and Jesus says to them, if you had Abraham as your father, you'd have the spirit of Abraham, you'd have the same attitude Abraham has, you would understand who I am, because I'm with the same spirit. And if they looked at just this very verse, even this verse about that we use for slavery, right in there is equality, because these people that are born in his house and those that are bought with his money are all circumcised at the same time, and they all enter into covenant with God. So they've all got access to a relationship with God in Abraham's household. He rules well his own household. Everybody knows about God, even those that are bought with his money. So these slaves are on a level with the Jews in this picture, that everybody gets circumcised and everybody enters into covenant. So there's an equality there that we should have learned from, and that we can see that Abraham has learned on one level to treat people in the right way in this issue of bond and free anyway, even though it has servants in that history. So then we drop down to verse 15. So we'll do 15 to 19, I think, about Sarah. I just see 15 to 21. And this is interesting, I think, 15 to 21.
And God said unto Abraham, as for Sarai thy wife, thou shalt not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be. And I will bless her, and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be her. Then Abraham fell upon his face and laughed, and said in his heart, shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah that is 90 years old bear? And Abraham said unto God, oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant with his seed after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenants will I establish with Isaac, with Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year.
So what happens here then? What else, Sister Katia?
Well, so God is renewing his covenant with Abraham and with Sarai, but Abraham laughed, which is like it doesn't really believe that could ever happen again. But this is because of his human eyes, and but God, insists in telling him that yes, the covenant would be with her, and with Sarai and with Abraham, but it will also bless Ishmael. And that yes, the seed should come from Abraham and Sarai also has a change of name.
And it's very interesting this. Can you think of anybody else in scripture, any other woman in scripture that God enters into covenant with in the Old Testament?
Not sure.
Deborah's a prophetess, so she's used as a prophetess. But I think this is the only incident, and this is the first. He's entering into Abraham, but he's also entering into covenant with Sarah.
Yeah.
So what is God doing here with Sarah? He's exalting Sarah, isn't he? Isn't he lifting Sarah to the level of Abraham? Everyone got equality right there. I think that's quite, I never saw that before we did today. I just thought, okay, why have they both got a name change? Because we know that name change is this sign of entering into covenant. And we say in this history that God only enters into covenant with men and circumcises men. But on one level, he's entering into covenant with Sarah because he changes her name. And the fact that he wants her involved in this process, that is definitely going to come through Sarah as well. And he's telling Abraham this to reassure Abraham of the role of Sarah in this model and how important she is. Thou shalt not call her Sarai. And Sarai means princess, but Sarah means noble woman. So it's almost like he's elevating the son. I mean, how can you get more elevated than princess, really? But maybe Sarah means more queen. I'm not sure. But it means noble woman. I will bless her and give thee a son. Yeah, I will bless her. She will be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her. So if she's not on a royalty, on a level with royalty, she can't have kings, can she? So he's making her a queen here, I think.
When I'm thinking of a princess, most of the time you can take a look at it as more outward beauty, because she was really fair, right?
Yeah.
But now we're taking a look at the inward side, being the noble, which is what God places in that morality.
So she's a noble woman. It's a good point. And he scoffs. Abraham says, how can this happen when I'm 100 and she's 90? And in his mercy, I think as well, what we see him do is that he enters this covenant, says this time next year she's going to bear a child. So, and presumably straight away he went to, and he says that he's going to bless Ishmael as well. In spite of that, he's blessing him. 12 princes shall he beget. So he gets this kind of covenant promise, like we know 12 tribes are going to be born later. We aren't pretty long, but 12 princes are going to come for Ishmael. And
Interesting that he gets the 12 right away, but it's another generation before Israel gets the 12.
And it's very interesting how Israel got that 12 as well. How Jacob got that 12, that's another story. We'll get there hopefully. But the thing about this, what's I going to say? Yeah, he gets 12 princes. He reestablishes his covenant. Presumably Abraham goes and tells Sarah this, so she's got encouragement, but she hasn't heard it for herself. And now in his mercy, he sends these, he comes himself, Christ, with these 2 angels to the tent door at Mamre. So let's just read 18, verse 1, and let's do 10 to 12. just to get the context in verse 1. So this is sometime later, and Abraham's sitting in his tent door. So I'll just read 1, and if you can read 10 to 12 and 15. And the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day.
And he said, I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life, and lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, After I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also?
She's calling him an old man.
And she becomes a queen. This very nice strokes now. Yeah, so now we have these 3 men that have visited Abraham in the tent door in the heat of the day, and they've come with this message, and Sarah gets to hear it for herself firsthand from God, that she's going to have a baby. And of course, she laughs about it, and she thinks, is it possible? And maybe there's a nervousness there. You know, people laugh and get nervous, but it doesn't seem that they're condemned for laughing. Although he says, wherefore did you laugh, Sarah? Wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I of surety bear a child which I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? So he's reiterating, you think anything's too hard for me? At the time appointed, I will return according to the time of life, and Sarah will have a son. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not, for she was a friend. And he said, nay, but thou didst laugh. Which is interesting, because she denies it, and she lies really, doesn't she, that she did laugh, and she did. And the men rose, but I think he understands her nervousness. The men rose up thence and looked towards Sodom, and this is obviously they're on the way to Sodom. I'm not sure of the connection of that, because this is all about Sodom, really. They're on the way to destroy Sodom, but on the way they give this promise to Sarah as a kind of like as an extra bonus. But is this the main cause of their mission, or is their mission to go and sort Sodom out? Or at least
It's a long trip. They got 2 birds with 1 stone.
if they got to, yeah, they did seem to get 2 birds with 1 stone here. So let's just conclude this section. We'll go on to actually, we didn't read about Abraham's test particularly when he sacrifices Isaac, but we'll deal with Isaac more in the next lesson. So in summary, we're seeing how the issues of Abraham are going to be passed down, or the weaknesses of Abraham are seen in his posterity, and how what he does affects the after generations. So he's given the promise that he will, this covenant from God, that he'll get a land, he'll be a great nation, he'll have a great name, and the Messiah will come through him. And that promise drives him from there on. And we see he's got issues when he gets down to Egypt with the famine, that he's got a fear of losing his own life, so he lies to deceive the Pharaoh about who Sarah is. He's got issues of sexism in the way he's treating her. He puts his own life before hers. He's paid as the brother. That Pharaoh gives him lots of goods because of Sarai. It's like a dowry. So we see the sexism, the patriarchal nature of the society at that time. That it's male dominated, that a brother should even get paid for his sister. He's not even the father. We see he's got a lack of faith on this issue. And then we see he comes down to the, we see these racism laws are passed in Egypt as a result of what happens with him there. There's a distinction placed between the Egyptians and the Israelites. They're not allowed to eat together now. And we see how that affects the after history in the life of Joseph. And that affects the whole, what happens, the dynamics with Joseph when he goes into Egypt and his brothers, and how they're segregated in Goshen, and there's issues of nationalism, racism there. We see how Hagar's an Egyptian slave. It's stressed twice that she's Egyptian. She's come out of that situation, and that affects later because now he's going to sleep with her. And it's in the climate of polygamy, which is sexist in itself, but they've accepted this as not a sin, when it's still seen as sin in God's eyes. He doesn't deal with it, but because of that, he justifies this relationship with Hagar. And so then we see the direct punishment, as it were, for those 2 sins, lying about Sarah and the marriage to Hagar. Because of his lack of faith, he has to now have the greatest test of faith that he's ever going to face in the sacrifice of Isaac, which we'll come to in the next lesson. So we see that what God is dealing with is these relationships with women on one level, and the covenant, the whole promise that he's promised this, that the Messiah will come through him. So it's all about the seed and this promise of the seed of Abraham, and how this seed is going to come about, and that's all connected to these relationships with women. And man doing it in his own strength and not in God's strength. So it's humanity over divinity instead of that combination. And at the end, we see how God is exalting Sarai. In this history, he is giving us a model of equality in one level because he's entering into covenant with Sarah when he changes her name. We see the place she's going to have after these two mistakes, because the first one, in a way, Satan's trying to do away with this promise. He wants to kill Abraham and Sarah. So in this history, her life's in danger. This is a satanic plot, because if she's out the way, they can't have the baby.
So he had the promise before he went to Egypt, right? So he gets to Egypt. And if he believed the promise, he would be like, I have no kids. I can't die.
Right, right. That's another level.
I'm invincible.
So on one level, this shows distrust in the promise, in the covenant promise. He doesn't, even though he believes that word, his faith wavers there. Faith wavers there. Yeah, you're right. Because how could he die? How could the promise be fulfilled if he died? But perhaps if Sarah dies, it could be fulfilled. So his own strength, he's thinking, I'll preserve my life because I have to have the promise. But she's okay, she's expendable. And this maybe goes right back to Adam and Eve. Because what's the sin with Adam and Eve? Eve distrusts God, she eats the fruit, and then Adam is deceived over his love for Eve. So he puts Eve before God. And in his own strength, he tries to save Eve in that sense because he doesn't want to lose her. And this is the same thing that's going here in a different, but perhaps in reversal. So he sees that his life's in danger. And he thinks, I need to be preserved to fulfill the covenant, but she's expendable. So maybe that's part of his motivation. Maybe God sees that it's actually a genuine motive that he has in preserving his own life. He's justifying his life because he needs to have the covenant promise fulfilled through him. Don't know, that's another angle on it. So, but for whatever reason, he should not have lied about her. But it is all connected to this fulfillment of the covenant. And God is trying to show him something about himself and his relationship with Sarai, and he elevates Sarai here. Not only does he change her name here, but he gives the promise to Abraham again that Sarah will be the mother of the child. And then he comes. So he enters into covenant with Sarah and gives the message to Abraham about her. And on top of that, he doubles it. He kind of gives her an extra blessing by he comes in person to tell Sarah, really, knowing that she'd hear that again. So we look at how he treats women in that history, and how beautiful that is, that he wants to put her in equality with Abraham, really, that she's just as important as he is in the fulfillment of this promise, giving birth to Messiah. So let's pray. We'll pick it up tomorrow. Oh dear, we're in a covenant. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the way that you have led us in our own experience to come to this place for such a time as this. We know that we have much to unlearn and learn again about equality and how we treat our fellow men. We see that we are not alone in this, and that as we look at the story of Abraham here, we see that he had many lessons to learn and unlearn, and he still has lessons to teach us here at the end of the world. We see that racism and sexism were issues in their society back then, but we see how you want to treat us, how you treated Sarah, and we see that contrast. We pray that you would be with us and guide us as we look at these stories to make application to our own lives in how we've treated people in the past, our expectations, our faulty thinking on our actions and how we have behaved. Help us to really see our past clearly and to get rid of every fear that we have that is hindering us from trusting in you. Please continue to guide us through this day and help us to prepare for your Sabbath. We ask and pray in the precious name of Jesus. Amen.
Yeah, he could have just strutted around like he was in